There's a place in California where the San Francisco Bay meets something far darker than water. A place where hundreds of men once waited to die. A place so old, it was built before the Civil War even started. And what happened inside these walls? Well, some of it seems almost impossible to believe. But every word you're about to hear is true. This is San Quentin State Prison. And this is its story. If you flew over the California coast today near San Francisco, you'd see something strange. Right there, on the edge of one of America's most beautiful bays, sits a massive gray building. It just doesn't belong. Sailboats glide by, seals swim in the water, and just feet away, behind thick concrete walls, is America's most famous death row. San Quentin opened its doors way back in 1852. Think about that. Abraham Lincoln wasn't even president yet. And here's the crazy part. The prisoners actually built it themselves. The very first inmates were brought in on a ship, handed tools, and told to build their own prison. Stone by stone. Can you imagine being forced to build the very place where you'd be locked up? It's like digging your own cage. If you're already hooked by this story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what you think. Your support keeps us digging deeper into stories just like this one. Over the next 170 years, San Quentin would become home to some of the most dangerous people in America. But it also became home to a mystery. How do you run a place where hundreds of men are waiting to die? What happens to people when they know they'll never leave? Let's start with what death row actually looked like. Picture a building made of concrete and steel, 5 stories high. No real windows. The air smells like metal and sweat. This was East Block, the main death row building. Inside were about 600 tiny cells, each the size of a small parking space. That's where a man would spend 23 hours every single day. The cell had a concrete bed, a metal toilet, and a sink. That's it. But what most people don't know is there were 3 different death row sections. East Block was the main one, but there was also North Segregation and the most mysterious one of all, the Adjustment Center. This was for the men who caused trouble even on death row. The most violent, the most dangerous. What happened in there was darker than most people ever knew. But San Quentin wasn't always about death row. When it first opened, it was a regular, but horrible, prison. Men slept in giant rooms, and disease spread like wildfire. The first execution happened in 1893 by hanging. But it was messy and often went wrong. So in 1938, California decided to try something they thought was more humane. They built a gas chamber. The gas chamber became infamous. A small, octagon-shaped room with windows for people to watch. The condemned person would be strapped into a chair. Then, cyanide pellets were dropped into acid. The gas would rise. Between 1938 and 1993, 196 people were executed in that room. But in 1992, a judge ruled it was cruel and unusual punishment. So California switched to lethal injection in 1996, thinking it would be cleaner and less painful. But here's the twist. California hasn't executed anyone since 2006. That's right. For almost 2 decades, hundreds of men on death row just waited. Some for 30 or 40 years. Longer than many of you watching have been alive. So what did they do all day? Life was a strict routine. Wake up at 6 a.m. Breakfast through a slot in the door. Then, waiting. Most days, they got 1 hour in the yard, a small concrete area with razor wire walls. 1 hour to feel the sun. The rest of the time was spent back in the cell. Reading, writing, thinking. Some men went mad from the isolation. Others found ways to keep their minds sharp, studying languages or writing books. But here's where the story gets even more complex. Some of these men claimed they were innocent. And sometimes they were right. Since 1973, over 190 people have been freed from death row in the U.S. after being proven innocent. Several were at San Quentin. DNA evidence, new witnesses. Imagine spending decades waiting to die for a crime you didn't commit, and then one day, you're free. Of course, many inmates had committed terrible crimes. One of the most famous was Charles Manson. He was originally sentenced to death, but his sentence was changed to life in prison. He spent years at San Quentin. For 172 years, San Quentin housed California's only death row. But in a massive shift, the state has now begun the process of dismantling it. The men once waiting to die are being moved to other prisons, and the infamous death row is being repurposed. This legendary, dark chapter in American history is finally coming to an end. The walls still stand, but the story is changing. What do you think the future holds for this historic site? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Imagine a job where your entire purpose is to keep men safe who have already been sentenced to die. That was the reality for correctional officers working on death row at San Quentin, one of the strangest and most intense jobs in America. You're not just a guard. You're responsible for the daily lives of people who, in the eyes of the law, have nothing left to lose. It's a profoundly complicated kind of responsibility, one that tests your humanity every single day. Some guards would form connections over the years. They'd have conversations, share small moments, and see the person behind the sentence. Others maintained a strict, professional distance, believing it was the only way to do the job without breaking. But no matter their approach, every officer understood one thing. San Quentin demanded constant, unwavering vigilance. A moment of distraction could have irreversible consequences. In this high-stakes environment, every day was a tightrope walk between routine and chaos. Then came August 1971. The epicenter of the tension was the Adjustment Center, a place shrouded in mystery, housing the most challenging inmates. On August 21st, the simmering tension finally exploded. What started as another day quickly spiraled into one of the most violent incidents in the prison's history. When the dust settled, the cost was devastating. 6 people were dead. 3 correctional officers and 3 inmates had lost their lives. The exact sequence of events on that day is still debated. Accounts differ, stories conflict, and the full truth remains buried under layers of tragedy and time. But what everyone agrees on is that it was a profound loss, a day that forever scarred the institution. This event became known as Black August, a somber marker in prison history. For some, it's a day of remembrance and reflection on resistance. For others, it's a grim reminder of a tragedy that should never have happened. And it leaves us with a question that corrections systems all over the world still grapple with today. How do you humanely and safely manage facilities housing people who are facing the ultimate penalty? The legacy of that day at San Quentin continues to challenge our ideas about justice, security, and what it means to be responsible for another human life. In July 2023, something truly unprecedented began to happen at San Quentin State Prison. Buses started arriving, but not to bring new inmates in. They were taking people out. Over 600 men who had been living on death row were being transferred to other prisons across California. Some had been in those tiny cells for decades, packing up the few belongings they owned, saying goodbye to guards they'd known for years, and leaving the only home many of them had known for most of their adult lives. It was the largest death row transfer in American history. So where were they going? To places like Quentin State Prison, San Diego's R.J. Donovan facility, and others scattered across the state. These prisons had to quickly prepare special units, train new guards, and set up new security systems. It was a massive undertaking. But why was this happening? The answer goes back to 2019, when California's governor made a bold announcement. He was putting a moratorium on the death penalty. All executions were paused. His reasoning was simple but powerful. The death penalty system in California was broken. It cost too much, it took too long, and worst of all, there was always the risk of executing an innocent person. Think about the numbers. California spent about $150 million every single year on its death penalty system. Yet, since 1978, the state had only executed 13 people. That's right, 13 people in over 40 years, despite having the largest death row in the entire country. Meanwhile, more than 130 inmates on death row had died of natural causes. Old age, heart attacks, cancer. They were literally dying of old age while waiting for their execution. The system was so slow, inmates were more likely to die naturally than to be executed. So the governor stopped it all. He even ordered the infamous gas chamber to be dismantled. But that left a big question. What do you do with all the men still sentenced to death who will likely never be executed? That's where the idea for a complete transformation came from. The plan was ambitious. Turn San Quentin into the San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. The focus would shift from punishment and death to education, therapy, and preparing inmates for a potential life outside. Now, you might be thinking, wait, these are people who committed terrible crimes. Why should they get rehabilitation? It's a fair question, and one that really divided the state. Some people believed it was exactly the right thing to do, that everyone deserves a chance to change, and that helping people is a smarter use of money than just locking them up forever. Others were furious. They thought about the victims and their families. They argued that some crimes are so terrible, the person who committed them doesn't deserve a second chance. Both sides have a point, and this tension is what makes San Quentin's story so complex. But the transformation moved forward. Starting in 2023, San Quentin began a massive $239 million renovation, modeled after Scandinavian prisons, which are known for being more humane and focused on rehabilitation. The new design includes classrooms, therapy rooms, and job training centers. But here's what's really interesting. They aren't tearing down the old death row buildings. East Block, the Adjustment Center, all those historic, grim structures are staying, just being repurposed. Why? Because San Quentin is a piece of American history, and some believe even the darkest parts of our history need to be preserved. As inmates were transferred, incredible stories began to emerge from behind those concrete walls. Former inmates talked about what life was really like. One man described playing chess with his neighbor by calling out moves through the wall. They couldn't see each other or the board. They just had to remember every piece's position in their heads. They played hundreds of games over the years, never once seeing each other's faces. Another man talked about feeding pigeons from his window, how they became his only connection to the outside world. These stories show that even on death row, people remain human. But there were darker stories, too. Guards opened up about the mental health crisis they witnessed. Years of isolation led to severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia. One guard put it this way: imagine telling someone they're going to die, locking them in a tiny room for 23 hours a day for 30 years, and then being surprised when they go crazy. And then there's the issue nobody wants to talk about. What about the people who might be innocent? In the U.S., over 190 people have been released from death row after being proven innocent, and several of those cases came right out of San Quentin. One man spent 15 years there before DNA evidence cleared him. You can't give someone back 15 years of their life. The story of San Quentin is a moral puzzle with no easy answers. It's about crime, punishment, redemption, and the very human stories hidden inside one of America's most notorious prisons. The chapter on death row is closed, but the story of what comes next is just beginning. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into complex stories like this. As 2024 turned into 2025, the transformation of San Quentin continued. For the first time in over a century, the old death row buildings sat empty. Construction crews began work on the new rehabilitation center, and all of California debated what justice really means. Some former death row inmates, now at other prisons, filed lawsuits about their new conditions. They argued that the prisons they were sent to weren't equipped for them, that the conditions were actually worse than San Quentin had been. Others adapted. They joined programs, made new friends, and started to think about a future that wasn't just about waiting to die. Back at San Quentin, the remaining general population watched the changes with mixed feelings. Some were excited for the new opportunities. Others were skeptical. They'd heard big promises before. But everyone agreed on one thing: San Quentin would never be the same. Today, if you drive past San Quentin on Highway 101, you still see those imposing gray walls and guard towers. But something is different. The energy has shifted. The prison that once held America's largest death row is becoming something else entirely. Something California hopes will be better. This prison story raises questions every society must answer. Questions about punishment and forgiveness, justice and mercy, about whether people can truly change, or if some acts are simply unforgivable. For 170 years, San Quentin stood as a symbol of America's approach to its most serious criminals. It saw hangings, gas chambers, and decades-long death rows. It housed infamous criminals and witnessed incredible suffering. But it also witnessed humanity. Men who taught themselves to read, who created art, who held on to hope when it seemed impossible. Guards who saw past the crimes to the person underneath. Families who never gave up. San Quentin's story is America's story. As it transforms, it forces us to think about what kind of society we want to be. Do we want to be defined by our worst moments, or by our capacity to change? The old death row is empty now. The cells that once held 700 men waiting to die are silent. The execution protocols are put away. What happens next is still being written. The new rehabilitation center is rising from the ashes of the old system. Whether this experiment works or fails, San Quentin has already taught us something important, that even in the darkest places, change is possible. The systems we thought were permanent can be transformed. The prisoners who built this place in 1852 couldn't have imagined what it would become. But their stories remain, etched into the walls, a reminder of where we've been, and a question about where we're going. This is the story of justice and injustice, of punishment and redemption, of death and, perhaps, rebirth. The walls still stand, but everything inside them has changed. And that might be the most important lesson of all. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested in this story. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next deep dive, and leave a comment below. Do you think people can truly change, even after committing terrible crimes? But there's one more piece to this story. One more secret that San Quentin kept hidden for all these years. Throughout its 170-year history, this prison wasn't just a place of punishment. It was also a place of unexpected creativity and transformation, happening quietly, away from the headlines. In the 1970s, something remarkable started at San Quentin. A group of inmates created a newspaper called the San Quentin News. It's still published today. Inmates write articles, interview each other, and discuss issues affecting prison life. Guards and wardens read it. So do people on the outside. Think about that. Men whose society had given up on were writing, editing, and publishing a newspaper, contributing something meaningful to the world, even from behind bars. And the newspaper wasn't the only thing. San Quentin developed one of the most extensive prison education programs in America. Inmates could earn high school diplomas, take college courses, and learn trades like carpentry and computer programming. Some even earned bachelor's degrees while on death row. One man spent 15 years studying law while waiting for his execution. He became so knowledgeable that he helped other inmates with their appeals. He couldn't save himself, but he helped others fight for their lives. Another inmate became a renowned artist. His paintings were exhibited in galleries, bought by people who had no idea he was on death row. His art outlived his time on earth. These stories challenge how we think about people who commit serious crimes. Can someone who did something terrible also create something beautiful? San Quentin proved that the answer is yes. There were also programs that brought the outside world in. For decades, volunteers came to teach classes, lead religious services, and run support groups. They saw the humanity that persisted even in California's most notorious prison. One writing teacher described how her students would write letters to crime victims, expressing genuine remorse. Most of these letters were never sent, but the act of writing them, of confronting what they'd done, changed these men. Then there were the therapy dogs. Yes, therapy dogs on death row. Inmates would spend time with these animals, learning patience and gentleness. For men who had been violent, these quiet moments became lessons in compassion they'd never received before. One inmate said the dog program taught him something he'd never learned as a child: how to care for something vulnerable without hurting it. It was a small thing, maybe, but for him, it was everything. Perhaps the most powerful programs brought inmates face to face with the consequences of their actions. In victim-offender dialogues, some inmates met with the families of people they'd harmed. Families got to ask the questions that haunted them for years. Why did you do it? Do you feel any remorse? And inmates had to answer. Some families found closure, others found more pain. But the process itself revealed something important. That accountability doesn't have to end with a prison sentence. Not every inmate participated. Not every inmate changed. The transformation wasn't universal, but it happened often enough to matter. Often enough to make us question whether our understanding of human nature is too simple. As San Quentin moves forward, it carries all of these stories with it. The violence and tragedy, yes, but also the stories of unexpected growth. The new San Quentin Rehabilitation Center will build on these programs, expanding them. The goal is ambitious: to create a prison where the focus is on what people can become, not just what they've done. Will it work? That's the question everyone is asking. California is conducting an experiment that the whole country is watching. Can you really rehabilitate people who have committed the most serious crimes? Can you balance accountability with compassion? These aren't easy questions, and San Quentin doesn't pretend to have all the answers. But it's trying. And in a system that has often felt stuck, that attempt itself is revolutionary. Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into stories that challenge how we see the world. And comment below, what do you think justice should look like? Is it about punishment, rehabilitation, or something else entirely? The sun sets over San Francisco Bay, casting long shadows across the walls of San Quentin. Those walls have seen almost 2 centuries of our evolving ideas about crime and justice. San Quentin's death row is gone now, but its impact remains. This prison showed us both the brutality of the system and the resilience of the human spirit. As we close this chapter, we open a new one on its rehabilitation center. The story isn't over. What happens next will determine whether this transformation is a bold success or a failed experiment. But San Quentin has already shown us something valuable. That change is possible, even in the places where we least expect it. The oldest death row in America is empty. The future is uncertain, but the lessons remain. Thank you for watching this documentary, for staying with us through this difficult, complex, and ultimately human story. San Quentin's tale is all of ours. It reflects who we've been and who we might become. The walls still stand, but inside them, everything has changed.